Hey guys, today I'll show you a fantasy thriller TV series named The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with the flashback of the early days of the Second Age when the Dark Lord Morgoth had just fallen in the region of Florod. A young man named Sauron stood before a gathering of orc warriors, speaking boldly. He proclaimed his quest for a transcendent power, one that, if achieved, could lead them back to Middle-earth. Seeing the skeptical expressions among the crowd, Sauron's tone shifted. He declared that orcs, seen as wretched creatures by the world, would face endless persecution unless they followed him and took the initiative to strike back. His words enraged the officers standing behind him, but before they could attack, Sauron struck first, killing one with a single blow. The orc warriors, awed by his display of strength, fell silent, none daring to challenge him. At this moment, the fallen elf Adar spoke up, pledging allegiance to Sauron as their new leader. Just as Sauron bent down to accept the Iron Crown, the symbol of authority, Adar suddenly betrayed him, stabbing him fiercely with the crown's blade. Other orcs joined in the attack, and Sauron was slain, overwhelmed by their blades. As Adar approached to ensure his death, Sauron's body began to emit a blinding white light, instantly freezing the surrounding area for miles. When the chaos subsided, Adar found only a pool of diabetic blood where Sauron's body had been. After the incident, Adar emerged as the orcs' new leader. However, none noticed Sauron's blood seeping through the mountain crevices, slowly pooling in a subterranean cavern. Before long, a rat scurried by, only to be ensnared by black tendrils. After absorbing enough essence, the tendrils left the cavern, eventually encountering a passing stable hand at the base of the mountain. The tendrils drained him as well, and Sauron was reborn, taking on his human form once more. It turned out Sauron had the power of resurrection. After a long journey, Sauron encountered a group of human refugees led by a kind old man who warned him against proceeding further, as the forests ahead had been taken by orcs. Sauron noticed the emblem on the old man's belt, recognizing it as the symbol of a fallen king. Sensing an opportunity, he decided to follow the group as they crossed the sea in search of new refuge. However, their ship was attacked by a sea monster during the voyage. Rather than saving the old man, Sauron stole his emblem. After being thrown into the ocean, Sauron used his innate powers to drive the sea monster away. By the time the ordeal ended, only a few survivors remained adrift with him. Among them was Galadriel, the elven princess whom Sauron would later form an unlikely alliance with, setting the stage for the stories of Season 1. Back to the present, after forging the 3 elven rings, Sauron's true identity was exposed by Galadriel. Forced to retreat, he returned to the lands of Mordor, which were now entirely under Adar's control. Earlier, Adar had used Mount Doom's volcanic eruptions to devastate the allied forces of elves and humans. Many humans were enslaved under orc rule. Sauron harbored a deep hatred for Adar, but knowing the time for revenge had not yet come, he leveraged his previous identity as the king of the Southlands to propose a deal with Adar. Sauron claimed that a sorcerer had crafted 3 rings of power, and through their metaphysical strength, he could enslave the entire orc army. He promised to reveal the sorcerer's whereabouts if Adar agreed to release his followers. Intrigued, Adar suspected that the sorcerer might actually be Sauron himself. Though curious, Adar refused to negotiate with a captured human. Confident in his arsenal of 1,000 ways to extract the truth, Adar had Sauron imprisoned in a dark cell guarded by a fearsome warg. A human traitor came by trying to persuade Sauron to cooperate, but Sauron ignored him completely. Enraged, the traitor threw down a bone and ordered the guards to teach Sauron a lesson. After taking a severe beating, Sauron picked up the bone and, murmuring something under his breath, tamed the ferocious warg into docility. At dawn, Adar visited the cell personally. Seeing Sauron's condition reminded him of his own days as a servant to Morgoth, shackled in chains in a dark prison. Adar decided to give Sauron a chance, offering him the choice to reveal the sorcerer's location and serve under him. This suited Sauron perfectly. He claimed that the sorcerer was a new persona he had taken on, and that he could lure him out by traveling to the Elven realms. Sauron proposed that Adar lead his army to destroy the sorcerer's refuge, erasing any threats. Pleased, Adar nodded in agreement, and Sauron knelt to swear allegiance. After the ritual, Sauron rode off on horseback. Back at the cell, the human traitor entered, but was instantly mauled by the warg. Soon after, Sauron arrived at an elven city whose lord was none other than Celebrimbor, the master craftsman who had forged the Rings of Power. Meanwhile, Galadriel, an emissary residing in the city, had no idea that her mortal enemy Sauron was present. Complicating matters, it was Galadriel who had brought the disguised Sauron to the city and even aided Celebrimbor in crafting the rings. The Elven High King was seething with rage. The gemstones set in the 3 rings, sources of their sacred light, were the last of their kind among the elves. The king had intended to use their power to restore the dying elven tree. Now, there was no way of knowing if Sauron had tampered with the rings during their forging. Elrond, the elven prince, was certain that Sauron had done something sinister and advised destroying the rings immediately. Yet the High King hesitated, unwilling to sacrifice the rings that might save their people from extinction. Without the tree's light, the elves would be forced to leave the Middle-earth, leaving its inhabitants to face the orc armies alone. After much deliberation, the High King decided to take the risk. Galadriel sided with him, but Elrond, stubborn as ever, defied them both and leaped off a cliff with the rings in hand. Thanks to his plot armor, Elrond miraculously survived the fall. He sought refuge with his friend, another master craftsman of high standing among the elves. After hearing Elrond's concerns, the friend dismissed the idea that Sauron was capable of such deception. However, Elrond remained adamant about destroying the rings, leaving his friend no choice but to honor Elrond's wishes. They decided to cast the rings into the deepest ocean trench. Meanwhile, the High King issued urgent orders to his commanders, warning them of Sauron's human disguise and instructing his soldiers to comb the shores for any sign of Elrond. Galadriel guessed that Elrond would seek out an elven craftsman he trusted to help destroy the rings. The High King immediately thought of Elrond's craftsman friend and rushed to his home, only to find Elrond alone. It turned out that the craftsman had already set sail with the rings. After a full day and night of sailing, the craftsman reached the ocean trench. Just as he prepared to throw the rings into the abyss, his ship suddenly lurched violently. Driven by curiosity, he opened the bag and took out the rings. Meanwhile, the Elven High King realized that retrieving the rings was impossible, and the ancient elven tree was on the verge of withering. Just as he was about to declare a mass migration, the craftsman strode in with an imposing presence. To everyone's shock, he was wearing one of the elven rings and claimed that these rings contained extraordinary powers. The High King reached out to examine it, but Elrond's loud exclamation startled him, causing one of the rings to roll to Galadriel's stinky feet. Instinctively, she picked it up and put it on, while the High King donned the last ring himself. The next moment, a miracle occurred. The ancient elven tree began to sprout new leaves, each one radiating a brilliant golden light. After years of decay, the elven tree was finally rejuvenated. Elsewhere, the mysterious wizard was traveling to Rhûn with his Harfoot friend Nori to unlock his sealed memories and latent power. The two found themselves lost in a barren wasteland, unable to find an exit. With their food supplies running out, Nori begged the wizard to use magic to summon some fruit. Hesitant, the wizard warned Nori to stand back as he muttered incantations. The ground began to shift, and Nori watched with excitement. But instead of fruit, the dead tree exploded violently, sending its roots flying. Though there was no food, the explosion unearthed insects hidden beneath the roots, an unexpected feast for the Harfoots. After the meal, Nori lavished praise on the wizard's magical abilities, leaving him visibly flustered. He admitted that this was nothing compared to what he could achieve if he had the staff he often dreamed about in his sleep. The wizard then noticed flickering lights in the distance, suspecting they were being followed. He and Nori quickly extinguished their campfire and hid among the rocks. At dawn, they lay in wait, eventually ambushing a shadowy figure. To their surprise, the intruder turned out to be one of Nori's fellow Harfoots, who had abandoned his tribe to join their adventure. Hearing of their plight, the newcomer recalled tribal lore about a similar journey through the wasteland. Following the ancient guidance, they finally found their way out, only to discover they were being tracked by a group of shadowy figures. One of them, a mysterious woman who had earlier tried to abduct the wizard, was revealed to be working for a dark villain who had grown impatient after her earlier failure. He assigned a masked man to take over the mission, claiming he had pinpointed the whereabouts of the wizard and vowing to capture him within 2 days. The man, revealed to be tasked with aiding humanity against Sauron, was unfortunately a shadow of his former self, barely stronger than an ordinary mortal. After traversing the wasteland, he fainted from dehydration. Nori and his companion dragged him along with great effort until they stumbled upon a well at the edge of the desert. They drew water and revived him. Upon awakening, the wizard noticed a dried branch by the roadside, its shape resembling the staff from his dreams. Just as he reached for it, the masked man and his minions arrived. The wizard instinctively gripped the staff and chanted a spell, unleashing a massive whirlwind of golden sand that consumed the attackers. The sheer force of the magic was beyond his current abilities to control, and the staff disintegrated into the sandstorm, sweeping Nori and her friend into the sky as well. The Dwarven kingdom faced an unprecedented disaster. The underground strongholds where they had dwelled for generations were struck by a catastrophic earthquake. Summoning his ministers, the Dwarven king learned that several mines had collapsed, and even the soil had become infertile. This was a clear sign that something was amiss with the kingdom's mountain ranges. The crown princess volunteered to sing the Song of Stone, hoping to commune with the mountain spirit. However, her efforts triggered even greater landslides, plunging the royal city into despair. Meanwhile, Galadriel and others in the elven capital were unsettled after wearing the three rings. Galadriel began experiencing vivid hallucinations in which Celebrimbor appeared, wearing a sinister smile, and whispered cryptic words that 3 rings for the elven kings, 7 for the dwarven lords, and 9 for mortal men doomed to die. Though she knew the visions were not real, she felt disturbingly tangible. The elven rings of power had now been forged, but Galadriel was still uneasy. She knew that Sauron sought to dominate Middle-earth and would undoubtedly use the rings to control minds, with Celebrimbor, the master craftsman, as his perfect accomplice. The High King was equally uncertain. Ever since donning one of the elven rings, he had been plagued by strange visions. The desolation of Middle-earth, white towers shrouded in darkness. Could these be glimpses of the future? Galadriel volunteered to lead a group to investigate Celebrimbor, fearing the chaos if Sauron sought him out. The High King approved, but insisted she bring a capable ally to avoid being deceived again. Galadriel immediately thought of the resolute and level-headed Prince Elrond, though he had grown despondent, believing that by wearing the ring, Galadriel had already aligned herself with Sauron. Fortunately, Elrond's craftsman friend demonstrated the ring's ability to manipulate the mind, emphasizing that it was merely a tool. Its morality depended entirely on the wearer. Elrond, finally convinced, agreed to join her. That night, the High King summoned Galadriel and explained that 5 elite warriors would accompany her, with Elrond leading the mission as her superior. Unbeknownst to them, Sauron had already arrived at the gates of Eregion. However, the proud Celebrimbor refused to entertain this fallen human king. Undeterred, Sauron stood outside for an entire day, his persistence unyielding. Annoyed, Celebrimbor finally went out to confront him, only for Sauron to pique his interest by saying that the elven rings he forged have revitalized the ancient elven tree. This news, which had not reached Celebrimbor due to the murder of a royal courier carrying the High King's letter, was enough to draw Celebrimbor into a conversation. Inviting Sauron into his forge, he eagerly sought to learn more about the rings. Discovering that his work could rival the masterpieces of the ancient elven smiths, Celebrimbor was overwhelmed with emotion. Sauron flattered him, claiming he had the potential to surpass even the greatest of his predecessors. With darkness spreading and chaos looming, Sauron argued that only the creation of a new supreme ring of power could restore peace to Middle-earth. Celebrimbor hesitated, insisting that the elven rings were his limit. He lacked both the ability and materials to forge something greater. Just then, Sauron mysteriously vanished, and the forge erupted in a brilliant blaze. Out of the flames emerged a figure with a deep voice, introducing himself as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Sauron, disguised as Anatar, used his charisma to manipulate Celebrimbor into believing every word. With just a few sentences, he had the master craftsman under his spell. With the elven rings completed, Celebrimbor turned his attention to crafting the 7 rings for the dwarves and the 9 for men. Not long after, Prince Duran of the Dwarves received an invitation from Celebrimbor to visit Eregion to discuss a matter of great importance. Being on good terms with the elves, Durin traveled overnight to meet him. Celebrimbor proposed that with enough mithril provided by the dwarves, he could forge 7 rings of power capable of repairing the damaged mountain ranges of the Dwarven kingdom, just as the elven rings had healed the sacred tree. Though Durin instinctively sensed something amiss, the stakes were too high. With the survival of his kingdom on the line, he reported the proposal to his father. The old king, though wary of the elves' so-called divine powers, had no choice but to agree to the deal for the sake of his people's future. Meanwhile, Captain Elendil, the commander of Numenor, searched for his son Isildur after the volcanic assault by Adar. He escorted the injured regent queen back to the capital, but could not find any trace of Isildur on the battlefield. Reluctantly, he ordered his forces to retreat, though Isildur's loyal horse refused to leave. Breaking free from its reins, the horse galloped off into the distance, eventually reaching the edges of the dark forest. There, it encountered a patrol of orcs. Against all odds, the horse miraculously escaped their attacks and charged deeper into the forest, stopping occasionally to sniff the ground as if searching for something. Finally, it entered a pitch-black cave and, incredibly, found its master Isildur, who was cocooned in webs. Swarms of small spiders surrounded him, and it was only with the horse's help that Isildur managed to free one arm. He pulled out a dagger just as the orc prisoner tied up nearby stirred awake. The noise attracted the attention of the Spider Queen within the cavern. As chaos erupted, the unlucky orc was killed instantly, while Isildur fended off the monstrous spider's relentless attacks. In a desperate move, he stabbed the Spider Queen in the head and seized the chance to mount his Ferrari horse, narrowly escaping the cave. Finally safe, Isildur dismounted to drink from a pool, only to find it littered with strange corpses. The dark forest was indeed no place for the living. Before long, he stumbled upon scattered supplies, likely left by human travelers. When he approached to investigate, a blade darted out from beneath a tarp. Isildur managed to grab the assailant's arm and realized the attacker was another human. Both were caught off guard, each having mistaken the other for an orc. The woman, introducing herself as Astrid, explained she was searching for her missing fiancé in the forest. Grateful to find a fellow human, they decided to journey together. After crossing the dark forest, Isildur arrived at what was once a Numenorean encampment, now abandoned. It seemed his father had already withdrawn the forces to the city. Pressing forward, they encountered an injured farmer. Despite Astrid's warnings, Isildur insisted on leaving food for him, only to walk into a trap. However, the farmer was a decoy, and the pair were surrounded by slaves serving the orcs. Just as all hope seemed lost, a single arrow struck from the shadows. It was the elf guardian Arondir, arriving just in time to save them. The enslaved humans scattered in panic, and Arondir's efforts allowed Isildur to escape with his Ferrari horse. The trio returned to a human settlement, only to find the village in mourning during a funeral for the village's only healer, who had succumbed to wounds sustained while defending the town from orcs. Arondir tried to console the healer's son, Theo, but the boy lashed out in anger. Furious and heartbroken, Arondir swore vengeance against the orcs, who were becoming stronger with each passing day. Elsewhere, Adar was gathering allies to prepare for Sauron's growing threat. Even the trolls of the Grey Mountains had pledged themselves to his cause. Their towering bodies were like living war machines. Meanwhile, Isildur remained fixated on reuniting with his Ferrari horse. Overhearing this, Theo revealed he knew where the enslaved humans were camped. Together, they ventured deep into the forest, where they spotted a bonfire surrounded by figures. Isildur's horse was tied nearby. Just as he began to untie it, the noise drew the attention of the camp. Theo stepped forward and revealed a scar on his arm, claiming to be one of the slaves. However, his bluff was called out immediately, and the camp's leader moved to capture him. Suddenly, a flying axe struck the leader, followed by chaos as the enslaved humans fell one by one. Theo himself was grabbed by a hulking figure. On another side, Elendil had just returned to Numenor when he received terrible news that the old king had passed away due to illness. Despite being a military commander, Elendil could sense the undercurrents of unrest within the kingdom, especially from the Grand Priest, who wielded immense power. The Grand Priest brazenly entered the Regent Queen's chambers without any respect or decorum. With the Queen's coronation just days away, he demanded she wear a red gown for the ceremony, a clear attempt to force her into submission. However, the Queen resolutely refused, recalling that her father had worn white during his coronation and that a great eagle had come to bless him. The Grand Priest stared at her without uttering a word. The day of the Queen's official coronation arrived, and Commander Elendil was steadfast in his support for this rightful heir. Yet not all shared his views. Among the dissenters was her own sister. Holding up an elven seeing stone, the sister accused the queen of relying on the dark magic of sorcerers and blamed her for the heavy losses suffered during their Middle-earth expedition. Seizing the moment, the Grand Priest ordered the destruction of the Seeing Stone. Elendil tried to intervene, but the artifact's latent power sent him flying back like a Barbie toy. The scene only fueled public belief that the stone was cursed. Amidst the ensuing chaos, a piercing cry rang out. It's the great eagle of Numenor descended upon the city. Its arrival was seen as an omen of a new ruler. The Grand Priest shamelessly stepped forward, bowing before the eagle. His supporters erupted in chants of his name as if proclaiming him the true king of Numenor. Meanwhile, in the elven city of Eregion, the craftsman Celebrimbor had begun forging the rings of power. After preparations were complete, Dwarven Prince Durin presented a piece of mithril, which Sauron deliberately grasped before tossing it into the fiery forge. The scene shifts to Galadriel, preparing to investigate Sauron's activities in Eregion, accompanied by Prince Elrond and 4 of the finest elven warriors. Their journey took them across perilous peaks until they were halted by an impossibly deep chasm. The broken bridge across the abyss made passage impossible, clearly not the work of mortal hands. Circumventing it would add 2 weeks to their journey, but crossing through the dark forest could save half that time. Just as they debated, Galadriel's ring warned her of imminent danger lurking in the forest. Despite this, Elrond deemed the risk necessary due to their tight schedule. Before entering, he advised Galadriel not to rely too heavily on her ring. She retorted sharply, stating that she merely sought to prevent needless deaths. The group soon ventured into the forest. Reaching an ancient burial ground, they saw tombs of long-deceased kings. One of the elves noticed a faint glow in the darkness and instinctively drew his dagger, while Elrond discovered the bodies of elven couriers from Lindon. It appeared that the craftsman Celebrimbor had not received the High King's warning. As they deliberated the cause of the couriers' deaths, a sudden iron chain ensnared one of the elves, dragging him swiftly into the shadows. Galadriel fought with all her might but could not prevent the tragedy from unfolding. Suddenly, the surrounding ground began to shift as ancient corpses emerged one by one from their graves. Galadriel recognized them as wights from the ancient burial mounds, impervious to ordinary weapons. Their bodies could only be shattered temporarily before regenerating moments later. As the group found themselves cornered, Elrond remembered a solution. He dashed into a nearby tomb, and while Galadriel struggled against a wight that ensnared her, Elrond managed to retrieve a relic weapon just in time to destroy the creature. It turned out that only weapons used by the wights in life could permanently banish them. Still, the group could not understand why these long-dormant corpses had suddenly awakened. After losing a companion to the ordeal, Elrond was filled with guilt. Galadriel tried to comfort him using words only, not her muscles, but her ring began to emit warnings once again, foreshadowing even greater dangers ahead. Frustrated, Elrond rebuked Galadriel for over-relying on the ring's power. At that moment, a scout reported hearing the sound of drums ahead. Approaching cautiously, the group discovered a massive orc horde traversing the forest. Their destination was Eregion, which might suggest that the orcs were preparing to wage war on the elves. Elrond insisted on reporting this news to the High King immediately. However, before they could retreat, a commotion arose behind them. It turned out a few orcs were chasing a horse, and a stray arrow struck one of the elven warriors. Tension ran high as Galadriel tended to the wounded. To her surprise, the injury began to heal itself, revealing another of the ring's mysterious powers. Galadriel handed the ring to Elrond, deciding to confront the orcs herself. Mounting the horse with remarkable agility, she charged into the orc patrol, creating chaos. Though she fought valiantly, Galadriel was eventually overwhelmed and captured by Adar himself. Elsewhere in a small border village, the townsfolk were searching for the missing Theo. Arondir found a discarded axe on the ground and began to piece things together. He mused that ordinary thieves would not have abandoned such a valuable weapon as it was worth more than gold. Following the trail, they stumbled upon a mutilated corpse. The villagers' immediate conclusion was that Theo had been taken by orcs, known to devour humans. Astrid, recalling her own encounter, suggested checking a polluted forest she had once passed through. It was highly likely that orcs were using the area as their base of operations. Arondir, however, grew suspicious of Astrid, noticing a burn scar on her neck, a mark used by orcs to brand their slaves. Though it had been burned off, it confirmed her association with the orcs. Without further discussion, Arondir bound Astrid's sexy body and forced her to lead them to the orc camp. Before long, the group arrived at the ancient forest Astrid had described. The once majestic trees had been trampled and ruined by the orcs, leaving behind muddy paths. Isildur, distracted, stepped into a hidden swamp. As Arondir tried to rescue him, both were dragged into the depths by an unseen force. Astrid was paralyzed with fear but eventually acted, stabbing a branch into the swamp. After a tense moment, a monster emerged to flex its head, preparing to attack her. At the last second, a sword pierced the creature's body, allowing Arondir and Isildur to escape. This harrowing experience led Arondir to reconsider Astrid's allegiance, believing her actions to be genuine. He freed her from her restraints, while Isildur promised to protect her for the rest of her life. Astrid urged Isildur not to act impulsively. As a branded slave, she would never be accepted by others. Arondir suddenly sensed danger and shouted for Astrid to drop her sword. Before she could react, a massive tree branch struck her, nearly sweeping Isildur off his feet as well. Arondir quickly spoke in Elvish, calming the towering tree. These ancient tree spirits were allies of the elves and had mistaken the group's weapons for orc tools of destruction. Another tree spirit appeared, explaining that the orcs had desecrated their forest with iron, stirring their wrath. Understanding their plight, Arondir pledged to drive the orcs out. The tree spirits, appeased, opened their branches to reveal a hidden cache of captives, including Theo, who had been taken by the trees for safekeeping. To Isildur's shock, Astrid's missing fiancé was also among the rescued. Watching the tree spirits retreat into the forest, Arondir bade farewell to the group, determined to confront the orcs and restore peace to the land. Elsewhere, the wizard was frantically calling out for his companions after losing control of his magic and accidentally blowing two poor Harfoots away. After searching for a while, he failed to find his friends but stumbled upon a black goat. The animal seemed strangely intelligent, leading the wizard to a forest folk with a big beard. Just as the wizard was about to ask a question, he noticed that the surrounding terrain bore a striking resemblance to the Run lands he had been searching for. Suddenly, the map in his hands floated into the air. Chasing after it, the wizard was led to a large tree. Upon seeing the branches, he was reminded of the staff from his dreams and reached out to pluck a piece. Unexpectedly, the tree began to twist and move on its own, pulling the wizard deeper until he was entirely engulfed. Not far away, Nori awoke from her unconscious state and quickly roused her friend. Determined to find the wizard, they stumbled upon a strangely dressed man who was about their height. Nori felt a strange sense of familiarity. After some questioning, they learned that he was from a nearby tribe of the Stout Folk. The man hesitantly suggested they seek refuge with his tribe, but repeatedly warned them to be wary of their leader. After giving this warning, he disappeared into a massive stone pile. Before long, they arrived at the Stout Folk's hidden village in a mountain valley. They saw many halflings carefully tending to their homes, making Nori feel a pang of homesickness. However, the tribe's leader soon appeared, exuding authority, and angrily questioned why the man had brought outsiders into their midst. Nori explained honestly that they had been pursued by masked men and lost their companions along the way. Upon hearing that their missing companion could use magic, the tribe leader's face turned pale with fear. She immediately ordered Nori and her group to be tied up, as magic in their land was associated solely with the dark sorcerer. Meanwhile, in a towering building not far away, the very sorcerer the tribe leader mentioned was the exact dark villain who was interrogating his masked henchmen about the wizard's whereabouts. The masked man, visibly shaken, admitted he had not expected the wizard to wield such powerful magic. The dark sorcerer waved his hand dismissively, ordering his men to focus on capturing the two Harfoots, leaving the wizard to him personally. However, what the sorcerer did not know was that the wizard had already been swallowed by an ancient, mysterious tree. At this moment, the forest folk murmured an incantation, and the wizard was suddenly pulled out of the tree, visibly shaken. He demanded to know who he was. The forest folk chuckled with his big beard, replying it had been a long time since anyone called him by his name. He was here before rivers carved the land and mountains rose to the skies. The wizard dismissed this as boastful nonsense and instead declared his desire to retrieve a branch from the ancient tree to serve as his staff. The forest folk neither confirmed nor denied this, but instead told him to ask the tree for permission himself. With a wave of his hand, the man summoned a flame from the hearth, which expanded into a roaring fire, and from it emerged an adorable sheep. Remembering his earlier experiences, the wizard began to realize that this forest folk could control air, trees, and fire simultaneously, a master of the arcane. He humbly requested the man to teach him how to control the staff. The man replied that the staff was already a part of him, as it was with any true wizard. He needed only to prove that he was worthy of it. Enlightened, the wizard finally understood that this was the Rune Lands, and that his goal here was not a staff, but the forest folk who would guide him. Just then, two figures on horseback appeared outside. The wizard immediately recognized them as the masked men who had been chasing him. The forest folk revealed that many years ago, another wizard had come to learn magic from him, but that person had later become the dark sorcerer who now ruled most of the Rune Lands. Yet even with his vast power, the sorcerer still thirsted for more. The wizard immediately realized what was happening, asking if the forest folk planned to ally with Sauron in Middle-earth. He nodded solemnly, explaining that if the two joined forces, Middle-earth would be plunged into chaos. The wizard, puzzled, asked why someone as powerful as him wouldn't stop it. The forest folk offered a cryptic smile and said he was a preacher, not a warrior. He added that great deeds must be accomplished by those destined to do so. The wizard then asked who he should need to confront, Sauron or the dark sorcerer. The forest folk replied he should deal with them both. Previously, the orc armies reached the Golden Citadel, and a great war in Middle-earth seemed imminent. Disguised as the elven Lord of Gifts, Sauron deceived master craftsman Celebrimbor into forging the Rings of Power. In desperation, the Dwarven king provided a vast quantity of mithril to aid the process. Through their collaborative effort, the 7 Dwarven rings were finally completed. Unable to contain his excitement, the old Dwarven king immediately put on one of the rings. Upon returning to the city, his first destination was the mines, where he astonishingly ordered the support walls to be demolished. Both Prince Durin and the chief miner strongly opposed him, but the king ignored their protests and started digging himself. Alarmed, the chief miner evacuated the workers, aware of the catastrophic risk of a cave-in. As the old king dug deeper, a loud rumble echoed through the cavern, followed by a ray of sunlight streaming in. Overjoyed, both Durin and the miner wept with relief. Weeks earlier, an earthquake had collapsed the light shafts, plunging the city into darkness and rendering crops impossible to grow. But with the ring, the king could now sense the veins of the mountain. Tapping on a rock wall with precise accuracy, he created an opening through which sunlight poured in, restoring light to the Dwarven kingdom. The citizens erupted in cheers, chanting the king's name. However, the princess felt an unease she couldn't ignore. As a Song of Stone singer, she could sense that the king's actions were a violation of the mountain spirit's will. Her worries deepened when she and the king visited the market to buy gifts for their children, only to discover that prices had doubled. They learned that the king had drastically raised taxes on goods. As the princess purchased a crystal ball, she accidentally dropped it and it rolled into the mines. Following it down a slope, she eventually reached a massive pit. Using her abilities, she quickly located the crystal ball, but as she picked it up, ripples appeared on the surface of a nearby pool. Meanwhile, the Dwarven king had summoned the leaders of 6 other realms to divide the 7 Dwarven rings as originally planned. Each leader was to receive a ring to wield its power over stone, ushering in a new era for the dwarves. However, the king suddenly changed his mind, demanding that the leaders surrender half of their mineral reserves in exchange for the rings. Outraged by his greed, the other leaders stormed out, but the king remained unfazed. Pointing to his map, he instructed the chief miner to dig even deeper, believing the rings allowed him to see all the mountain's hidden treasures. At that moment, Prince Durin burst into the room, pleading with his father to stop. The princess had heard the mountain's voice. A great and ancient demon lay dormant beneath the rocks. The king dismissed the warning, declaring that the Song of Stone singers could only listen to the mountain, while he could see it clearly. The king claimed that the resources they had mined over millennia were but a fraction of the mountain's true wealth, and the princess must have been mistaken. Unbeknownst to the dwarves, Celebrimbor remained oblivious to the effects the rings had on their king. He was still basking in the glory of his accomplishment, even crafting a monument to commemorate the cooperation between elves and dwarves. But no one was more pleased than Sauron, who, disguised as an elf, saw the completion of the Dwarven rings as a stepping stone to his next goal, the 9 rings for humans. However, Celebrimbor began to hesitate. He had crafted the rings for the dwarves because they provided the crucial mithril, but he doubted the merit of aiding humanity, which was perpetually embroiled in internal conflicts. Sauron argued that precisely for this reason, the 9 most virtuous individuals should be chosen as the bearers of the rings of men to govern humanity's 9 kingdoms. But Celebrimbor, satisfied with his accomplishments, rejected Sauron's proposal outright. Furious, Sauron stormed off, declaring that he would forge the 9 rings himself. Without Celebrimbor's expertise, however, his plan seemed doomed to fail until strange noises began emanating from the forge. Rushing to investigate, Celebrimbor found his tools mysteriously floating in midair. Moments later, a loud noise erupted from the furnace. Following the trail of a hammer, Celebrimbor stumbled upon a half-finished ring. Suddenly, an elven smith materialized, explaining that after wearing the ring, she had been transported into another realm, where a fiery demon filled with deathly energy approached her. Sauron interrupted her tale, claiming that he had added additional materials to the rings of men to enhance their power. Celebrimbor was about to object when a guard interrupted to announce the arrival of Dwarven Prince. Durin revealed that his father had grown cold-hearted and greedy since wearing one of the Dwarven rings. Before forging the ring, he had promised to share it freely with the 6 other lords. Celebrimbor insisted the forging process for the Dwarven rings had been identical to that of the Elven rings, so there was no way the rings could be flawed. Durin then delivered a pointed question, wondering what if the fault lied with the person who forged them. Celebrimbor froze, suddenly recalling the mysterious Lord of Gifts who had appeared out of nowhere. Without hesitation, he confronted Sauron, demanding to know whether he had tampered with the Dwarven rings. Sauron, caught off guard, quickly spun a new story. He claimed that while the forging process was the same, the spiritual resonance during the crafting of the Dwarven rings had changed. He argued that the only way to counterbalance the Dwarven ring's corruption was to forge the 9 rings for men. Overwhelmed by the revelation, Celebrimbor glanced toward the elven capital of Lindon, where the High King resided. To ensure the king did not interfere, he had earlier written a deceptive letter claiming that the forges had been sealed. The High King, who had received Celebrimbor's letter days earlier, could not shake a deep sense of unease. The Elven rings continued to warn him of turmoil in Middle-earth. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the High King, a large force of orcs was marching toward Eregion. Upon discovering this, Prince Elrond immediately abandoned his current task and even disregarded Galadriel's capture to rush to Lindon and warn the king. Back in the Dwarven kingdom, Durin was still trying to persuade his father to relinquish the Dwarven ring. Even Celebrimbor had admitted that the rings were flawed, yet the king refused to heed any warnings. Entranced by the ring's power, he believed its gifts far outweighed any potential dangers. Returning to his chambers, Durin was met by the princess, who solemnly warned that the kingdom was on the brink of disaster. She pleaded with him never to touch the ring. Elsewhere, Celebrimbor, once again deceived by Sauron, announced his plan to forge the 9 rings for men, claiming that they would work together with the Elven rings to counterbalance the Dwarven rings. Across the ocean, in the human kingdom of Numenor, a power struggle had recently concluded, leaving the Regent Queen dethroned. The Grand Priest seized power, becoming the kingdom's most influential figure. His son, basking in privilege, boasted that he would never need to work another day. But the Grand Priest's ambitions did not stop there. Gazing toward the elven towers across the sea, he declared that immortality was not exclusive to the elves. Meanwhile, the Regent Queen was confined to the royal tower, her power stripped away. Commander Elendil, disheartened, believed that the queen still had loyal soldiers who would help her reclaim her throne with a single order. But the queen shook her head, refusing. She explained that the Seeing Stone no longer showed visions of the city's destruction. Perhaps the Grand Priest's rule would lead the kingdom down a different path. Though Elendil vehemently disagreed, he promised to restrain himself. However, trouble soon found them. A purge swept through Numenor's navy, stripping all soldiers loyal to the queen of their positions. Even Commander Elendil was not spared. Handing over his sword marked the moment he was reduced to nothing more than a commoner. That night, Elendil led a group of retired soldiers in a memorial for their fallen comrades. However, the prince unexpectedly barged in with his entourage, announcing that the new king had ordered the temple to be sealed. Elendil clenched his teeth and held his temper, preparing to leave when the elderly priest insisted on straightening the statue of the deity before departing. Elendil found the request reasonable, but the prince shattered the statue in front of everyone, causing an uproar. Unable to bear it any longer, Elendil punched the prince to the ground, fully prepared to face imprisonment for his actions. As the prince tried to retaliate, Elendil's loyal follower intervened, refusing to let his leader be humiliated. The two began to wrestle with their muscles fiercely, with the follower ultimately disarming the prince. Just as he was about to drive the sword into the prince, Elendil shouted for him to stop, not wanting the situation to escalate further. The follower hesitated, but eventually dropped the sword, only to be stabbed in the chest by the prince moments later. Furious, yet bound by his loyalty to the queen's orders, Elendil restrained himself, allowing the prince's guards to escort him away. Meanwhile, the orc vanguard emerged from the mountains, with the elven city of Eregion now in their sights. Fortunately, Prince Elrond reached the elven capital just in time to warn the High King of the impending invasion. To his surprise, the High King refused to mobilize their forces, explaining that they could not defeat both Adar and Sauron at the same time. At the same moment, Galadriel, captured and confined to an orc prison cart, stepped out calmly when the doors opened. Adar appeared, but Galadriel seized the opportunity to take him hostage. Unshaken, Adar suggested that they join forces, arguing that they shared a common enemy. The orc armies launched a full-scale invasion, marking the official start of the war between races. Arondir darted through the dense forest, encountering a group of orc sentries. Without hesitation, he unleashed a flurry of strikes, swiftly eliminating 3 of them. Among the corpses, he discovered a map showing the orcs' planned route to Eregion. Unbeknownst to him, the city's lord, Celebrimbor, was engrossed in forging the 9 rings of men and remained unaware of the approaching orc army. Strangely, all his recent attempts at crafting the rings had failed, and even his supply of the key material mithril was nearly depleted. Frustrated and enraged, Celebrimbor's demeanor had completely lost the grace and composure of a master craftsman. At that moment, Sauron appeared, seemingly at the perfect time. Gently dismissing Celebrimbor's anxious men, Sauron offered to solve the mithril shortage and take charge of managing Eregion's affairs. Distracted by his work, Celebrimbor failed to realize that his authority over the city was being quietly usurped. Later, someone reported to Sauron that a soldier had washed ashore that morning. Upon inspecting the writing on the corpse, Sauron's expression darkened. The words were written in Orcish, stating where he was. Sauron deduced that this was left by the orc commander Adar as a signal. Their earlier deal had been clear. The disguised Sauron would help Adar locate the revived Sauron, while Adar would send his forces to kill him. Standing atop the city walls, Sauron gazed out at the faint outlines of the approaching orc army, his face unable to suppress a triumphant smile. What Sauron didn't realize, however, was that Adar had already seen through his disguise. Instead of killing Galadriel when he captured her, Adar proposed an alliance because they both shared a common enemy. Adar revealed Morgoth's crown, claiming it was the weapon he once used to kill Sauron. He explained that Sauron's resurrection was only possible because the crown had lost its Silmarils. Now forged into the elven rings, these gems were the key to utterly destroying Sauron. Adar proposed retrieving the elven rings, combining them with the crown to annihilate the evil Sauron completely. Galadriel thought Adar's plan seemed feasible, but as an elf, how could she possibly collaborate with orcs? Meanwhile, in the distant Dwarven kingdom, the old king had completely changed since obtaining the Dwarven ring, working his citizens to exhaustion by forcing them to endlessly mine for resources. Prince Durin, filled with anger, stormed into the Great Hall and spotted Sauron, disguised as an elf. When he learned that Sauron was there to demand mithril, Durin instinctively wanted to refuse, but Sauron offered to trade for anything in return, only for the old king to flatly decline. Watching Sauron storm off in a huff, Durin felt relieved, believing his father had not succumbed to greed. Little did he know, the old king had a different plan. Mithril would become even more valuable with Middle-earth on the brink of war. When Durin attempted to snatch the ring, he was repelled by an invisible force, thrown to the ground like a Barbie toy. The princess believed the ring would destroy not only the old king, but the entire Dwarven kingdom. She urged Durin to take action, suggesting a compromise. She would stand alone at the mines to block entry. If the king ordered his soldiers to attack her, it would expose his greed to all his subjects. Durin agreed to the plan, and soon enough, the miners and soldiers arrived at the entrance to the mines. The princess stood firm, activating her stone-singing abilities, unleashing a swarm of bats that disrupted the soldiers. Durin emerged from behind a rock, ready to face an entire battalion if necessary. Meanwhile, the Numenorean stronghold was still trapped in political infighting, unable to act. On the other side, the newly ascended Grand Priest finally caught Elendil in a compromising situation, and he wasted no time sentencing the commander to death. However, his tone quickly shifted as he offered Elendil a chance to avoid execution by swearing loyalty to him. Elendil's eyes hardened as he firmly refused, declaring that Numenor only had one true ruler, Regent Queen. Enraged, the Grand Priest ordered the guards to drag Elendil away. A nearby justice minister suggested following tradition and handing Elendil over to the sea beast for judgment. A woman standing nearby turned pale and rushed to the dungeon to plead with her father. She begged him not to be so stubborn. No one survived judgment by the sea beast. Elendil shook his head, replying that she wouldn't understand. He had already lost faith in this treacherous daughter long ago. The woman, however, suddenly stood and declared that the Grand Priest had anticipated this outcome and arranged for the Queen herself to come and act as a mediator. Elendil knew that what the Regent Queen valued most was not her throne but the stability of the entire kingdom. Yet how could he betray his beliefs just to survive? As the heavy horn blew, the Grand Priest led everyone to the seaside altar. Following a pompous and lengthy trial, 2 soldiers dragged Elendil to the platform, preparing to toss him into the sea to feed the monster. However, Queen Regent suddenly appeared. According to the kingdom's laws, Elendil's crimes were hers to answer for, so she should be the one to face judgment. Hearing that this was indeed the law, the Grand Priest reluctantly stepped aside. Elendil had no objections either. He could only watch as the Regent Queen stepped into the deep waters. Everyone held their breath, staring at the sea's surface. Moments later, Regent Queen was pulled underwater. She felt the presence of a massive creature approaching her, its murky eye twitching slightly. Just as those on shore were about to declare her dead, a massive wave erupted from the ocean, and the Regent Queen was thrown back onto the shore. According to the kingdom's traditions, anyone who survived judgment by the sea monster was destined to lead the nation to greatness. The Grand Priest was unwilling to accept this and used the Elven Stone to glimpse the future, only to see the shadowy figure of Sauron. Meanwhile, far away in the land of Rhûn, the wizard finally found a reclusive master with extraordinary powers. Under the master's guidance, he began to grasp some basic fire magic, enabling him to foresee impending danger. He suddenly realized that his dear friend Nori was in great peril. His heart sank. The forest folk urged him to let go of distractions, saying that to save others he must first wield great power, and it's time for him to claim his staff. The 2 of them quickly arrived at a canyon where rows of withered trees stretched endlessly. The wizard felt a sense of despair. Finding the right branch for his staff would take months. The forest folk asked if he had any other choices. Torn between rescuing Nori or pursuing the staff, the wizard resolved to save his friend first. The forest folk immediately stopped him, saying if he missed this chance, he would never find the staff again. With that, the forest folk disappeared, leaving the wizard to his agonizing decision. Meanwhile, Nori indeed faced danger as the masked men scoured the region for her, putting the entire tribe of the robust kin in jeopardy. The tribe leader had been shielding Nori at great personal cost. When the masked men finally left, the leader told Nori it was useless to run. The dark sorcerer's reach extended to every corner of Rhûn. Nori grew desperate, offering to surrender herself to spare the tribe. Fortunately, her stout friend had a clearer mind. She reminded Nori that the dark sorcerer wanted to use her to lure out the wizard, who was far more important. Nori found herself caught in the same moral quandary as the wizard. Elsewhere, Galadriel finally made her decision. She revealed Sauron's entire plan to Adar, the construction of the Rings of Power in Eregion to dominate elves, men, and orcs alike. With this knowledge, Adar began to rally his forces. Galadriel tried to dissuade him, pointing out that his forces were insufficient to take Eregion, but Adar ignored her and signaled to the valley below. Galadriel was shocked to see an entire army of heavily armed orcs already assembled. Adar had been preparing for this for a long time. As he blew the horn to signal the first assault on Eregion, the orcs began their coordinated attack. In Eregion, the city's watchmen spotted siege weapons approaching from the distance and immediately sounded the alarm. Inside the palace, Celebrimbor heard the commotion and prepared to investigate, but Sauron blocked his path, insisting everything was fine and that Celebrimbor must be mistaken. Sauron's insistence only made Celebrimbor more suspicious. Ignoring Sauron's objections, he pushed the doors open, only to see a calm and peaceful scene outside. Sauron walked out leisurely, stating that the priority was forging the 9 rings of men. As for the urgently needed mithril, he had secretly obtained some while visiting the Dwarven kingdom. Celebrimbor, moved to the core, assured Sauron that this time he would surpass the works of the great masters. But the moment Celebrimbor stepped back into the palace, the city once again descended into chaos, with scenes of war and turmoil unfolding outside. Calm and composed, Sauron ascended the tower and smiled at the sight of the orcs across the river. His plan was proceeding smoothly. Meanwhile, the orcs skillfully operated their trebuchets, launching flaming projectiles toward Eregion. The orcs used the cover of night to unleash a wave of trebuchet attacks on the elven city. Though crude, this tactic proved highly effective. Chaos erupted within the city walls, and only Sauron, disguised as an elf, remained calm and unbothered. His sole purpose for coming here was the Rings of Power. The city's fate was of no concern to him. At that moment, a deputy rushed in asking why Lord Celebrimbor wasn't taking charge. Sauron furrowed his brow, replying that the city lord wasn't willing to fight back and believed the moat would protect everyone. Just as his words fell, the orcs suddenly ceased their trebuchet assault. It turned out Adar had ordered his forces to target the towering mountains by the river instead. With each massive stone launched, the towering peaks began to collapse, taking the dam below with them. The once protective moat was reduced to muddy terrain, leaving a region vulnerable to the advancing orc army. When Arondir arrived, he saw the moat turn to sludge, a clear signal that the assault was about to escalate to direct combat. Yet, in Celebrimbor's eyes, the scene outside still appeared serene and idyllic, a result of Sauron's ongoing illusions. Sauron couldn't be more pleased, frequently checking in with Celebrimbor about the progress of the 9 rings. Yet something in Sauron's tone struck Celebrimbor as off. The so-called Lord of Gifts had never shown such impatience before. Noticing the same rat as before, Celebrimbor marked its path with a line on a candle, suspecting something was amiss. Meanwhile, the battle outside raged on. The orcs pushed forward relentlessly, and the elven warriors atop the city walls held their ground with exceptional archery. However, they all knew this was not a sustainable defense, especially as the orcs began rolling out siege engines, prompting the elves to focus their arrows on these massive contraptions. Far away in the Dwarven capital, the old king had received a plea for help from the elves of Eregion, but completely ignored its contents. Instead, he ordered the mining master to dig even faster and threatened to eliminate Prince Durin if he continued to block the mines. The mining master agreed verbally, but quickly sought out Durin and his wife. He explained that the old king had been consumed by the power of the Dwarven ring and urged Prince Durin to take a stand. However, before doing so, he insisted on consulting an elven messenger. To their surprise, the messenger turned out to be none other than Elrond, a prince of the elves and an old friend of Durin's. Hearing of Middle-earth's plight, Durin promised to send reinforcements. At the same time, Celebrimbor inside the city noticed that the marked rat repeatedly followed the same path and that the candle with the mark remained unchanged for an entire day, refusing to burn down even an inch. He realized he had been deceived by the scenery around him. Sauron hurried to explain, claiming he had merely wanted to provide a peaceful environment for forging the rings. Celebrimbor hurled his forging hammer with all his might, smashing a window and letting the sounds of chaos from the battlefield flood into the room. With that unintended act, Sauron's illusions were shattered. Celebrimbor looked at the war-torn elven city and silently turned back into his chamber. To his horror, his own palace had been shattered. It finally dawned on him that the mithril used in forging the rings was fake all along. Sauron raised his hand slightly, revealing that the primary material used in the rings was his own flesh and blood. At that moment, Celebrimbor realized that the so-called Lord of Gifts standing before him was none other than Sauron himself. As Celebrimbor stepped out of the palace, a flying rock struck him and sent him tumbling. Despite his injuries, Celebrimbor staggered across the crumbling towers to find his deputy. He confessed that they had all been deceived by Sauron. Before the deputy could respond, Sauron calmly appeared behind them. Celebrimbor ordered the soldiers to seize Sauron immediately, but none of them moved. One soldier explained that during his absence, it was the Lord of Gifts who led them into battle. The deputy attempted to escort Celebrimbor to safety, but Sauron telekinetically shoved the deputy off the wall. Being the nearest to the scene, Celebrimbor had no way to clear his name. Sauron whispered into his ear, telling him to forge the rings and he would spare the elves inside the city. The battlefield echoed with the sound of horns, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. It was none other than the High King himself, charging forward with Elrond leading the cavalry. The elves rode like a tidal wave toward the orcish army, but their commander Adar stood unfazed. He held Princess Galadriel hostage, prompting the High King to call for a ceasefire. Before long, Elrond arrived at the orc camp, where Adar proposed an alliance to combat their common enemy, Sauron. But Elrond, seeing the elves' city under attack, could not allow himself to compromise. Adar offered to trade Galadriel's life for the elven rings. Once again, Elrond refused. As he turned to leave, he removed the badge from his shoulder and discreetly handed it to Galadriel during a parting embrace. When his deputy asked how they would counter an army 10 times their size, Elrond assured him that Prince Durin would arrive with reinforcements by dawn. For now, their priority was to destroy the orcish siege engines. Elrond threw himself into the fight, weaving through enemy ranks while the orcs' momentum began to wane. Adar noticed the change and ordered more siege engines to the front lines. Meanwhile, Galadriel disguised herself as an orc and quietly infiltrated their encampment. She was surprised to find that orcs held burial ceremonies for their fallen comrades, something she never expected. Just as she prepared to slip away, one orc spotted her unusual hair color. Realizing her cover was blown, Galadriel braced herself, but an arrow suddenly struck the orc. It was Arondir, arriving just in time to save her. While all this unfolded, Sauron continued pressuring Celebrimbor to complete the forging of the 9 rings. Exhausted and desperate, Celebrimbor decided to destroy the rings by throwing them into the forge. But even after waiting for several minutes, the rings remained untouched by the flames. Realizing he had no other choice, Celebrimbor resolved to smuggle the rings out of the city, no matter the cost. Bound by magical shackles, he could not break free. His eyes fell on a guillotine lying on the table. With grim determination, he placed his thumb under the blade, severing it to free himself. Carrying the 9 rings, Celebrimbor fled the chamber, but his escape was cut short when a massive projectile crashed down, leaving him gravely injured. When Celebrimbor regained consciousness, he was already discovered by guards who had heard the commotion. As they prepared to escort him back, Galadriel suddenly blocked their path. Having already witnessed Sauron's manipulative prowess, she saw Celebrimbor's tragic state and, filled with sympathy, insisted on taking him away immediately. However, Celebrimbor shook his head, saying that the highest priority was to ensure the rings of power were taken to safety. With that, he entrusted the rings to Galadriel, and as the rightful lord of the city, refused to abandon his people. He left behind his final words, and with his head held high, returned to the palace with the guards. Outside the city, the battle had reached a fever pitch. Cannonballs relentlessly battered the walls, and Elrond's forces were utterly exhausted. One elven archer, riddled with arrows, still managed to muster their strength, and using their ability to connect with the mind's eye, precisely ignited an oil barrel near the orc siege engines. The explosion lit up the battlefield, and though the archer perished heroically, their comrades turned their grief into strength, hacking down the relentless orcs. Adar, sensing a shift in the battle, unleashed his hidden weapon. The orcs suddenly made way, and with a thunderous roar, a towering troll emerged. Even the most elite elven warriors were powerless against it. Their arrows couldn't even penetrate the troll's thick hide, making it a terrifying weapon of war. Despite being repeatedly thrown back, Elrond kept cutting at the ropes holding the battering ram, and though he was injured, his efforts caused the troll to stumble. However, its injuries weren't fatal, and it soon stood up again, resuming its assault on the city walls. Just as the city seemed doomed, the High King arrived on horseback, providing much-needed reinforcements. Taking advantage of the distraction, Arondir leaped from the walls and plunged his blade into the troll's weak spot, finally bringing it down. With Elrond and the High King landing blow after blow, the fearsome troll finally let out a death wail and fell. Watching from afar, Adar roared in fury, drew his blade and issued the order for a full-scale assault. By this time, most of the High King's soldiers had fallen, and as the sun rose, the Dwarven reinforcements still hadn't arrived. Then, a wounded messenger arrived with grim news. The Dwarven army wouldn't be coming. Elrond's face turned pale as he muttered that Durin would never break his word. What Elrond didn't know was that Prince Durin's mobilization efforts had been going smoothly. With the support of his advisors and the overwhelming approval of his people, the prince rallied a formidable force. But just as they were about to set off, the mining minister delivered troubling news, saying the old king was digging frantically, determined to release the beast from beneath the mines, as warned by the princess. Left with no choice, Durin's army had to remain to guard their home, lest their kingdom be destroyed. This left the Elven army in a dire situation. The High King, realizing the odds, steeled himself for the worst. Shouting for his troops to form ranks, he led what few warriors he had left in a final, desperate charge against the advancing orcs. But their strength was no match for Adar's overwhelming forces. Within moments, the elves fell one after another, and the once impenetrable walls began to crumble under the relentless onslaught. In no time, large hordes of orcs stormed into the city, their guttural war cries echoing through the ruins. The orc horde, after days of relentless battle, finally breached the elven city of Eregion. Without the protection of its walls, the elven defenders scattered like grains of sand, continually flanked and divided by the orcs. Galadriel led a group of women to break through the siege, ultimately escaping through a hidden passage. However, what she did not expect was that a squad of orcs had been lying in wait at the exit. Stepping out alone, Galadriel was willing to sacrifice her life to secure the women's freedom, as she still carried the 9 rings of power forged for men. Meanwhile, to protect Galadriel's escape, Celebrimbor chose to return to his palace and face Sauron. When confronted by the Dark Lord, he ordered his guards to seize Sauron, but the Lord's power was overwhelming, forcing the guards to turn on one another. Once again, Celebrimbor was at Sauron's mercy. The Dark Lord fired multiple arrows, purposely avoiding fatal blows to keep him alive, intending to extract the location of the 9 rings. However, Celebrimbor remained resolute and defiant, refusing to reveal any secrets. He cursed Sauron, declaring that one of the rings would ultimately lead to his doom. Enraged, Sauron drove his staff through Celebrimbor's body, ending the life of the renowned craftsman. Shortly after, a group of orcs entered the palace, and upon seeing Sauron, they were immediately paralyzed with fear and wet themselves. Their leader, as if enchanted, obediently revealed his name. Meanwhile, in the Dwarven kingdom, Prince Durin learned of his father's madness. With no time to lose, he descended into the mines, accompanied by his furious wife, who lamented that the old king had become a slave to the cursed ring. Durin took a deep breath, steeling himself as he ventured into the depths of the mine. He found the old king tirelessly digging, unyielding in his pursuit of the mysterious mithril veins. Furious, Durin raised his mighty axe, threatening to sever his father's hand if he did not stop. The old king turned calmly, asking if he truly had the courage to strike him. Durin hesitated, his axe trembling in his grip. Without another word, the old king resumed his digging, and just moments later, the mine's wall crumbled, revealing a dazzling vein of mithril. The old king roared like a goose, declaring this is the true wealth of the Dwarven kingdom. For a moment, Durin was awestruck by the brilliance before him, but their awe was short-lived as a fiery red light ignited in the depths of the mine. Out of the shadows emerged the ancient Balrog, its fiery whip cracking through the air. Merely one wave of its hand sent Durin flying several meters back. The old king seemed prepared for this moment, placing the dwarven ring on the ground before picking up his axe. Turning to Durin, he declared he was already strong enough to become king of the dwarves. With those words, he charged at the Balrog, launching a desperate attack. The old king sacrificed his life to hold back the mighty Balrog, temporarily saving his kingdom from complete destruction and granting the dwarves a fleeting moment of peace. At this moment, Galadriel had already been brought before Adar by the orcs. On Adar's hand was an elven ring, which he had previously taken from Elrond. With the power of the ring, the scars on Adar's face had healed, but he had also foreseen a terrifying future. It was as though he had become an entirely different person. Surprisingly, he handed the ring back to Galadriel, hoping it would quell the hatred between the orcs and the elves. He believed only this could ensure Sauron's ultimate defeat. Galadriel put on the ring and was about to ask what Adar had foreseen when a group of orcs carried in their injured lieutenant. The report came that the lieutenant had refused Sauron's influence and suffered the consequences. Adar bent down to comfort his subordinate, but in the next moment, a dagger plunged into his abdomen. To his shock, the orcs had all fallen under Sauron's sway, and so Adar met his tragic end at the hands of his own soldiers. Emerging triumphantly, Sauron ordered the lieutenant to destroy the elven city, but to leave key individuals alive to extract the whereabouts of the ring. As the orcs marched off to fulfill their orders, Galadriel stepped forward to confront him, demanding to know if he had planned all of this. Sauron didn't respond, instead picking up a metal crown from the ground, parrying an attack from her sword with it. Finally facing her greatest nemesis, Galadriel resolved to stop at nothing to defeat him. Meanwhile, the elven city had been reduced to ruins. High King Elrond and the elf Arendir were forced into the central square by the orcs, helplessly watching as the statue of the elven goddess toppled and shattered. The sight tore through their hearts, but the worst was yet to come. The orcs announced their intention to burn all of Master Craftsman Celebrimbor's notes and creations. Elrond cried out in anguish, begging them to stop, but the orcs only grinned as they lit the torches. As the flames consumed the pages, the elves were left hollow and broken, their spirits crushed. Not far away, the battle on the mountainside raged on. Galadriel abandoned all defense, focusing solely on dealing as much damage to Sauron as possible. But Sauron's abilities were bizarre and ever-changing, his form shifting constantly. As Galadriel seemed to gain the upper hand, Sauron finally spoke his mind. He confessed his genuine feelings for Galadriel, promising to crown her as his queen once he unified the realm of Middle-earth. Galadriel responded with cold resolve, her sword striking with fiery determination. At last, Sauron dropped his pretense, driving her toward the edge of a cliff. With his crown gripped in his hand, he struck with finality. Galadriel declared that the people of Middle-earth would never yield. Sauron, wearing a cruel smirk, bent down to retrieve the 9 rings of men from the ground. Suddenly, a horn sounded from the valley below. It was the Dwarven forces arriving to aid the elves. Arendir and his allies fought valiantly, eventually joining forces with Prince Durin. On the mountainside, Galadriel's hope reignited. She knew Sauron desired the remaining elven rings, so she gripped them tightly and leaned backward, allowing herself to fall toward the valley below. This act was witnessed by the High King and his allies. A defeated orc lieutenant rushed to inform Sauron of the elves' escape, but Sauron, enraged, ended the messenger's life with a single strike. By then, the High King had found the gravely injured Galadriel. Sadly, his elven magic alone was not enough to heal the wounds inflicted by the Dark Force's corruption. Seeing this, Elrond quietly picked up the elven ring from the ground. He realized he had no choice but to harness the ring's power. Elsewhere, the wandering wizard found himself trapped in an agonizing dilemma. The forest folk had told him that his staff lay hidden somewhere in the forest. Yet if he ventured to retrieve it now, he risked missing his chance to rescue his friends. After much contemplation, the wizard followed his heart and made his choice. However, when he arrived at the fortress of the hulking tribe where Nori was being held, he found it already occupied by the dark sorcerer and his men. The wizard confirmed he had never seen this sorcerer before, but the dark sorcerer pretended to be an old acquaintance. There were 5 of them in total, yet the wizard's disbelief was evident. He demanded to know why the sorcerer captured Nori. The dark sorcerer feigned surprise and explained that his men were simply too wild. With a flick of his staff, the sorcerer sent the masked leader of his men hurtling into a rock wall, freeing Nori and the members of the hulking tribe. The tribe leader exclaimed it was this sorcerer who has enslaved them all along. The dark sorcerer hurriedly retorted, saying they should not waste their pity on such weak creatures. The wizard countered him, saying those would make them no different from Sauron. The sorcerer's patience finally snapped. He declared he would leave him no choice, raising his staff as the boulders above them began to crack. The tribe leader roared, and the tribe scattered in panic. The wizard, filled with urgency, raised both hands, and the crumbling boulders froze mid-air. While the wizard's actions saved many from the hulking tribe, their home was left in ruins. Nori, overwhelmed with guilt, believed the disaster was her fault and vowed to help the tribe find a new place to live. This also meant she would have to part ways with the wizard, as he had his own path to follow. As he watched his friend leave, the wizard discovered a broken tree branch in the rubble. A strange sense of familiarity struck him as he picked it up. When he returned to the forest folks' cabin, the truth became clear. The choice between power and friendship had been a test. By choosing friendship, the wizard earned his true staff. The forest folk, with a knowing smile, called the wizard's name Gandalf and welcomed him back. In a remote border town of Middle-earth, Isildur, the son of the commander, decided to return to Numenor. His companion Astrid came to see him off and accidentally revealed her feelings. She confided that she had no affection for her fiancé, and Isildur promised to take her with him to Numenor. But to his shock, the son of the high priest arrived with an army, intending to turn the town into a human outpost. Recognizing his old friend Isildur, the high priest's son no longer showed his former camaraderie, and instead ordered Isildur to be taken aboard the ships, leaving Astrid on shore, gazing after him with worry. Meanwhile, though the Regent Queen had gained the favor of the sea, she still hadn't consolidated her power. The furious High Priest flipped the table, forging a letter from Sauron to frame the Queen for conspiring with the Dark Lord. This scheme led to the downfall of her loyal followers, plunging the city into utter chaos. Isildur's father, Elendil, escaped the soldiers' hunt with his daughter's help. He snuck away to inform the Queen, intending to flee with her to Middle-earth. But the Regent Queen refused. Instead, she entrusted Elendil with the sacred sword, instructing him to head to Middle-earth and find hope for humanity. The city had fallen into corruption, but mankind could not abandon hope. Meanwhile, Galadriel awakened from unconsciousness to find the High King rallying the remnants of the Elven forces. Her resolve was reignited. After all, Celebrimbor had said what defeats darkness is not power, but the light that shines everywhere. Together, they vowed to unite all allies and challenge the Dark Lord Sauron once more. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.